Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. I hope you've had a wonderful and Merry Christmas. We are here for the end of the year edition and we're going right back to the start. It is the two founders of the podcast, myself and Councillor Richard Kemp. Hello, Richard.
Hi, and you had a good Christmas?
Very good Christmas, Richard. Although I've had this lurgy that's going around giving me a little bit of a cough, so the mute button may be on ready supply for this episode.
But you look all right.
Thank you there, old man.
Particularly since your hair's grown half an inch.
Yeah, thank you.
I wish I could say the same for mine.
Yes,
it's half an inch. There isn't enough of it left.
Like a little bit of frosting on the pavement there. It's looking a bit thin at the moment. But no, welcome to
the insult's over.
Yeah. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers. And we want to send a particular big thank you to everyone who has supported the podcast via Patreon this year. We've had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of listeners and viewers and comments on all our platforms, whether that's if you listen to it on the podcast, on your commute, or you put us on the big TV on your YouTube app. We really do appreciate it. And those are people on Patreon that do send us a little bit of money every month. We really do appreciate your support. And because we all do this for free, and we really appreciate everyone, all the nice comments of people that help them on, whether it's campaigning or getting the Lib Dem slanted news as we do. But this, Richard, is our end of the year one. And I was very interested. I actually listened back to our previous end of the year one that we did in Stockport with Lisa and Tom and Hannah, etc. Good to know that we got several of our predictions absolutely right. All of us predicted Boris Johnson would not be Prime Minister by this time. And I even said the next Prime Minister will be Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. The only bit I got wrong is I said or instead of and for the year. But if we think about this year, Richard, I mean, the big story at the start of the year was Boris Johnson and Partygate. There was the Sue Gray investigation. He finally admitted to going to parties and apologised. But obviously, that saga lasted. I mean, he stayed on. I also remember when actual Boris Johnson stood down was actually in July. So, I mean, it was almost 6 months. How did you feel that went for Boris Johnson in terms of, do you think he should have gone earlier for the benefit of the Tories?
Well, I'm surprised. I was surprised he staggered on so long, frankly. It was setback after setback after setback. And the interesting thing to me has been they were serious yet minor at the same time, compared, for example, to the huge losses on PPE and the way that Baroness Moan, if I said it right, we all moan about her, so I might as well say that, just almost absconded with so much of our cash. And he was an absolute genius to his successor. So when you look back at it, you could say, oh, just a few drinks. He misbehaved. But in fact, it was cumulative. Anyway, I got that right in the end. Misbehaviour, that's what did for him. And of course, the sex scandal at the end of the day that wasn't his, but the way he failed to deal with it. So how did he last so long?
And it was weird because if you think about it, in February, one of the big changing points, as I think Boris got more desperate, I think Boris would use anything and everything to cling on to power. I think he would sell his grandmother down the river if it meant he kept into power. But interesting, in February, I think there was a quite significant turning point because he did the Jimmy Savile smear on Keir Starmer, saying, Keir Starmer failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, which was clearly nonsense. It was a lie. He lost Munira Mirza, who was his key policy person from right back in the time when he was mayor of London. And I think Tory MPs there thought, hang on, he's the desperation has started to come in. But what was interesting, obviously, Boris did step down eventually in July after the Chris Pincher scandal and after Tiverton and Honiton, which we'll get to later on in the episode. But actually, you know what was strange for me? And I wonder if it was surprising for you, Richard, that we heard after the Liz Truss debacle, and again, we'll get onto that. So there's been a lot of politics this year. After the Liz Truss debacle, Graham Brady has said Boris Johnson did have the numbers to challenge Rishi Sunak, but he chose not to. Why do you think he decided not to come straight back? Because he probably would have won. I mean, Tory members probably would have chosen Boris over Rishi.
Yes, but would his first stumbling block, I would guess, was Tory MPs, because their process they choose the last two to go
But it would have
down
only
twice.
it would have only been him and Sunak though. So that would be that was the so. But so I mean, for me, I would say I think Boris realised he couldn't command support of the parliamentary party.
Yeah.
Not to the fact he would have become leader again, but would he been able to form a cabinet?
Well, there was a lot of debate as to whether he'd actually got what was it needed, the 100 MPs behind him.
Graham Brady's
clearly, if he was on it, he was just getting on top of it.
Yeah.
And if you're just getting on top when there's 300 of them, then you're right. He won't command that support. And perhaps, one of the things that surprised me about both him and Truss was their love of the perks. So what did Truss do a lot of the time in her 7 weeks, apart from screwing up the economy, which she would have done in 5 weeks if the Queen hadn't died? She was there at, I think it's called Chevening, the former Foreign Secretary's place, as well as Chequers, inviting her mates in. Where did Boris Johnson go when he lost power? Oh, off to the Grace and Favour accommodation. Perhaps the Lib Dems should adopt this as a policy. We ought to abolish those places. Perhaps you keep one of them because it might be useful if the president of the USA comes. You don't need 3 and you only use them for business. Now, how's that for a policy that would appeal?
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Praetor Rains. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Praetor Rains have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Praetor Rains are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Praetor Rains website at praetorrains.co.uk/liberal-democrats. And one of the other big stories that came out in March, but kind of which got linked to obviously the biggest story probably of the year, which was the war in Ukraine, was actually the exposure of Russian money, particularly going towards the Tory party in the wake of, when people were trying to have sanctions against prominent Russians, and all this information came out about how much dirty Russian money is swashing around, particularly in London and in our political system. So it is interesting what you say that, because it is something that, we're going to talk perhaps more later in the show about where politics goes from now, whether that is how we get onto a better kind of politics, because I think for me, Boris Johnson was a legitimate threat to the consensus of British politics that we've had so far. That, the good chap rule that people won't. Boris didn't care about any of it. Boris absolutely the rules that normally govern this game, he ignored and was happy to ignore, and he became very dangerous to the point where I had people who wouldn't normally be that interested in saying, do we now need a British constitution to stop people like Boris getting away with anything?
I mean, to my mind, the rot all started with the referendum, because clearly Russian money came into that. Clearly, they broke the rules on both campaign funding and the use of illicit information. The Supreme Court ruled not that that didn't matter, but it shouldn't be acted upon because it was only an advisory referendum. If it had been a compulsory one, it would have had to be refought. And we've known for some time that people have paid £50,000 Russians have paid £50,000 to go have a tennis match with Boris Johnson or whoever. So there is corruption there. And again, perhaps this is the opportunity for the Lib Dems to lead the way. I know we do get some big donors and we're encouraged to go and ask people for money. But I think no business, no person, no organisation should be able to give more than, let's say, £25,000 to a political party. I like the fact that it may be force of circumstance, but I wouldn't want to change this, that what funds the money is the money that comes from your pocket and mine. That's clean. Okay, I use some of my council expenses to do that, but that's because I spend a lot of money putting information out about what I do as a councillor to my people. So I think it would be incredibly popular, and I think it's very important if we put in some sort of rule like that. It won't get through because, of course, that would affect Labour finances as well.
No, that's correct. And I suppose the other big moment during the Boris premiership of this year was actually the local election results as well. I remember before they happened, there was all these things say, if the Tories lose 100 councillors, it will be a disaster. I think that was the headline in the Mail or the Express.
Yeah.
It said they lost nearly 500. They lost 485. Break down those local election results because it is interesting. The Tories lost to 485 councillors. They lost 11 councils. They lost control of 11 councils, which is the big hit. And they were probably quite lucky that it wasn't the counties, which had been the year before, because they would have lost significant levels of their main support. Labour gained 5 councils and 108 councillors. Lib Dems did the best, actually, in terms of gains of councils. We gained 224 and we gained 3 councils along the way. So it was actually a good set of local elections for the Lib Dems, particularly in places like Somerset, where we gained the council. And I'm sure, Richard, you'll have others. I mean, other parties, actually, weird enough, Plaid Cymru didn't do anything. SNP did a little better. Greens got 87 new councillors, but again, not really showing massive growth. I remember, interestingly enough, on the podcast from last year, which I listened to, we were talking about the Greens, beg your pardon, on about 9% in the polls. Will they break through in 2022? And no, they didn't. That, in fact, is, can you name the Green leaders at the moment, Richard?
Caroline Lucas.
No,
that's what most people think.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's interesting. We're not going to do much on the Greens, but the fact is the Greens have, given how important the climate has been this year and a cost of living crisis, for the Greens to have that USP and have done nothing with it shows you that they really don't have the infrastructure, it seems like, to really progress much further. But the Tories losing that local election vote was yet another problem that hit Johnson, and by that point, I think the writing was on the wall. We saw soon, not too long after that, in the Chris Pincher scandal, waves of ministers going, and then Boris quickly left the door. Let's talk about one of the other big things that happened.
Just before we leave the local elections, though, you rightly said that 3 councils went into Lib Dem control, but actually 5 or 6, I can't remember, it might even be 7, moved into no overall control with us leading it. Yeah. And as you will know, but many people won't, that we do a change of control operation, joint thing between the LGA, Lib Dems and ALDC. And I got 3 councils to talk to before, talk to immediately afterwards, and I reported back to Alan Connett, who runs the operation for us, saying no need to do anything. And then 30 minutes later, I got a phone call from him and said, "You've got Wokingham." I said, "I beg your pardon." And there was a council that we came, not from nowhere, we'd been building up gradually. They didn't anticipate taking control, but we'd become not the biggest party, but clearly with the opportunity to work with 3 Labour and 2 independent councillors. And I just want to give them credit, because people say, do councils really matter? I can tell you, in Wokingham and Woking and the other places we've taken control, Lib Dem control really matters. It's really making a difference. They're going into those councils, sorting out the difficulties, shining a light into the inner recesses. So well done to our controlling councillors, whether it's NOC or full control. They're doing a blinder for our party and the people they represent.
And let's stick on this then, Richard, because obviously we've got local elections coming up in May. People like myself are up. You're up as well,
Yes,
and actually,
you haven't got a song about your ward, though, have you?
No. Well, no. That's what I'll do for this time. Anyway, we definitely don't have the rights for that. Yeah, absolutely. Is that, how do we think councils, Lib Dems are going to do in council elections going forward? Because, again, just to remember, 2019 was an exceptionally good year for Lib Dems in local councils. It was when Theresa May was in absolute all sorts of troubles. So how do we think Lib Dems are do? And how do you think councils are going to do? Because, again, the funding formula for councils hasn't been that improved. I do wonder if, I represent two different councils. Actually, I'm actually on three, but I won't include the parish for now. But the two councils I'm on, Lancashire and Preston, both are looking like financially we're getting near the point where we're going to be in serious, serious trouble. And how do we think that's going to affect the local elections next year?
Well, of course, I come from Liverpool, where we've been in serious trouble for years. We're having to find 73 million. We did get a better settlement than we'd anticipated. I thought, oh, that's good. It won't be 73 million. We have to find only about 58. And then they've discovered that some of the cuts they wanted to introduce are not capable of introduction. I think that we're setting up real problems for the future. Every time we don't spend something now, be it a troubled family, be it someone who's elderly, we store up spending problems for the future. The old person ends up in hospital and stays there. The young person is maimed for life psychologically in many cases. We're anticipating cutbacks in the public health grant to match. The housing stock is getting worse and worse, and that leads again. It's not a finance-free option. That leads to increased spending in hospitals and social care. We're not investing money, and the best way to invest money in preventive and proactive things is through councils. Where's that going to leave the Lib Dems in the local elections? Well, frankly, it depends who you're facing. I sometimes wish that some people would defect from somewhere to the Tories in Liverpool so we could wipe them out yet again, but we did that 26 years ago. I think for people like you and me facing Labour, we'll do okay, but we'll do okay in areas where if we didn't exist, they might be Tory. If you're fighting hardcore Labour in Liverpool, Manchester, etc., it's going to be a war of attrition, although because we have all-up elections, I'm very optimistic about what we'll do in Liverpool. But if I was fighting the Tories, I'd be going for it.
And I will say to those people who are facing Labour, I don't want them getting dispirited about this because the wheel always turns. That's the point. And so what you want to do is, if Labour are maybe going to come into power in the next couple of years, this is almost like their high watermark. So you've got to think, you've got to establish your base in order to capitalise on that later on, because Labour, we'll talk a bit more about Labour coming up, about whether they are as popular as what some people think they are. But I do, there will be easier areas and less easy areas. And I take on, I have a Tory county council and a Labour city council, but I do deal with the suburbs, which deals with a little bit of both, but mainly Tories. Is that even though 2019 was a good year for us, I'm not expecting to lose any seats this year coming. And actually, hopefully, touch wood, we can start wiping out the Tories in the rest of the suburbs in Preston. That's kind of but like all these things, and it's really important to remember, don't over-target. You've got don't overcommit yourself. You've got to know, if you think, you know what, I'm going to take out every single Tory in this whole council, and you win none of them. That's not doing anything for you. So go back and watch our episode on targeting, and it talks about which seats you should do, how you can do it, particularly if you've got a small team. That'll be very worthwhile.
You're quite right about the wheel turning. I remember that we took control of Liverpool in 1998. We didn't expect to. We thought we'd do it in 1999. That was 1 year after a Labour government took over. In places like Liverpool, they were released of having to vote anti-Tory by doing it through the Labour Party. So you're absolutely right. Get to a strong base, and then when the tide turns against the Labour Party, you can move in and take control.
Yeah, and likewise, if you're see, one of our patches. So there's one ward in our city that is the last of the suburban wards that the Tories have all three councillors for. Our job is to break into that ward before, again, that wheel turns and Tories get booted out of power potentially. So actually, we then have a base in that ward to be able then, regardless of what happens nationally, we can then outwork them locally. But it's a lot easier to do that if you're already in there beforehand. So that's kind of our goal for those wards.
Yeah, and of course, even better is to get rid of the buggers altogether, because it's incredibly difficult, as we know, to our cost in councils all over the country. If you've got no one there to know what to campaign on, how to campaign on, to get the media. So if you are in a council area, never mind a ward, where there's no Liberal Democrat at all at the moment, be the first and see if you can get a mate, because once you do that, your credibility so increases. So yeah, 1 or 2 wards might be the right strategy in some areas, and make sure you win. And Salford, for example, I can say I think they've got 2 councillors now, and they're beginning to get publicity in the regional media. So it does work if you're there.
Yeah, pick a ward and win it is still the phrase. And also, just remember, it's a little bit easier. Some of the more awkward things about standing for election, including getting 10 signatures, has been reduced. So these things, it is now less onerous to stand. So, but if you need advice, talk to the LDC, talk to your regional party. Come and message me and Richard. We're always happy to come and help out local parties that have very little kind of previous infrastructure or anything like that. But Richard, so moving on from the local to probably the biggest success for the Lib Dems, which came at Tiverton and Honiton. And this came about because of the Tractorgate scandal, which, if those that don't know, the Tory MP was caught watching porn twice in the House of Commons, and he came up with the wonderful line of, it was actually, I was looking for tractors, not for porn, and apparently this tractor was called the Dominator, and, and ended up on a website. But how you do that twice, no one's quite explained. But that led to the by-election in Tiverton and Honiton in June, which was again, I was down there for a week, thoroughly enjoying myself. It was another huge rural kind of seat, a bit like North Shropshire that we won this time a year ago. And let's be honest, it was a spectacular win. It was
absolutely.
It was a historical win in terms of the amount of we got there. And congratulations to Richard Ford for everything he's done and getting elected, and also in his time since being elected, he's done a grand job. But did you actually go down to that election, Richard? I can't remember if you actually went.
Yes, I went to Tiverton, so I missed out some of the fun because it was a sort of a quieter election place, so it wasn't quite the buzz that sometimes you can get from going to a by-election. But there's no doubt that in the areas that I did, and I walked to everywhere, so I did some canvassing, I did some a lot of delivering in the town itself. There was quite clearly a big change going on. The hostility when I went round the corner with a bunch of leaflets, and they said, "Oh no, you're a Lib Dem. All 4 of us are voting for you." So I could tell. I have been doing by-elections before. That there was something going on there. And we had exactly the right candidate for that constituency, in my view. One is he's very good. He lives there. He's committed to it. He comes from a background which is more appealing to some areas than others within the army. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but sometimes that would be difficult in some areas. But he's a thoroughly small R representative of his area, which is why he could become the big R representative of the area. And as you say, I follow him on Twitter. The issues he's taking up, just like our other 2 new MPs, shining a light on things that have been neglected for donkey's years, and every credit to them. And
and those good learns from Tiverton and Honiton that we talked about in the reaction podcast and episodes since is that, don't forget, we were in 3rd. So we have had conversations in the past, or do we need to do so many leaflets? Well, particularly if you're in a 3-way marginal or you're hoping to leapfrog both Labour and the Tories, you need to establish yourself as the key challengers. And one of the ways you do that in by-elections is particularly about volume and effort, particularly at the start of the campaign. Because by the time Labour got going, they'd already had X amount of leaflets from the Lib Dems. They'd had 2 door knocks. It was evident that only the Lib Dems could win in a seat like that. It was either going to be Lib Dem or Tory. Labour, the Greens, had no chance. And it was the same in Cheshire and Amersham, where we were second, and completely the same as North Shropshire, where again we came from third and Helen Morgan went on to win it. But it was interesting because at the same day as Tiverton and Honiton, this kind of leads into our conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about Labour now, is actually the Wakefield by-election happened, which was a very nonplussed win for Labour.
Yeah.
And we talked about this a year ago at our end of 2021 special, where we said the Tories are unpopular, it doesn't mean the Labour are massively popular. And even though since that point, and particularly since Liz Truss, which we'll get to, the Labour poll bump has gone whoosh like that. If you dig into that polling, again, that is a lot of the Tory vote collapsing, not necessarily flooding across to Labour. And so obviously that links as to where do those Tories vote? Do they stay at home? Do they go reform? Some will come to the Lib Dems. As we know from polling, we see where switchers actually go to. But I'm really interested, and we did a whole episode on this, about whether Labour will get a majority at the next election. Now, the polling suggests they will. However, the detail of the polling suggests they might be being a bit optimistic. And Labour are very confident, and Keir Starmer's trying to rein them in a little bit now. But where do you think the Labour Party is nationally right now, Richard?
Well, just before I answer that, let's talk about, I just want to mention leaflets again and the need to build up your presence. It's very, for local elections as well as national, it's very interesting to me that we've got 23, what I would class now as bedrock wards in Liverpool. And the Labour Party have been adopting candidates and doing work everywhere except those 23. All their competent people have chosen to fight a safer seat somewhere else. I think we're more than 23, incidentally, but those are what we class, and clearly the Labour Party do as bedrock. Labour Party, again, it's a bit hard for me to say because Labour Party isn't very popular in Liverpool. But my perception is that Labour are doing well simply because they're not the Tory party.
Yeah.
So if you talk to people about Keir Starmer, yeah, he's okay. But he's not Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair was really, really popular before he took power. He was a live wire. He was electric. He was going places. And Keir Starmer, you could imagine him with a wig on, say, "If it please you, my lord," prattling around in a court. So I don't think there's a lot of popularity for him. And the Labour Party are in a big muddle about some of their policies. They want to do business with us after an election. I think I agree with your analysis. They may very well have to. What are they saying about Europe? Oh, it's dead and gone. We can't do anything now. That couldn't be a negotiating stance with the Liberal Democrats or the SNP or the Greens. Now, whether they formally have discussions with them is one thing, or whether they go for a grace and favour or something like that.
Confidence and supply.
Confidence and supply, yes. They will need to have some big policies that we agree with. And I can't see them being there at the moment.
And I think the big worry for Labour is twofold. I think, firstly, they're showing only small signs of progress in Scotland. I think I'm not expecting them to wipe out vast areas of the SNP, as we talked about. Go back and listen to our episode on Will Labour reach a majority. That wasn't directed at you, Richard. That was to our listeners. But yeah, do that as well.
I always listen. I honestly, Joe, I do. It's memorised.
The one thing that's come out very recently since Truss left and Sunak has become Prime Minister is actually the level of favourability between Keir Starmer and Sunak is virtually identical in terms of, there will need, I mean, we might not like the fact that politics becomes very presidential and personality. Who do you want to be Prime Minister when it comes to a general election? But that is part of the factors people take in. The reason why Boris Johnson was so successful is that he was up against Jeremy Corbyn. That is not a particularly difficult fight. Keir Starmer and Richie Sunak are almost locked in terms of where their favourability lies. And I think that's a worry for Labour because I think they'll have to be doing much better. And so we will see. 2 years is a long time in politics. It looks like we are going to have a 2024 election, but we will see where it goes.
But just picking up your point about the opinion polls flattering, the knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, we've got to get the Tories out, vote Labour. And then people then start looking in their own constituencies and say, well, Labour have only got 2 councillors and 10% of the vote. So I think a lot of that Labour anti-Tory vote will in 30, 40 constituencies, the ones we're targeting, will in fact move back to us. And so that 9-10% we're on at the moment is below the level that I think will really exist.
And it's us showing that we are the challengers. And I think of Alison Bennett, our wonderful panelist who's in Mid Sussex. Yeah. So that came up. So Mid Sussex came up in one of those seat prediction ones as going to Labour, which was utterly nonsense. There isn't a single Labour councillor. They have no money, no organisation, and they think they're going to go from 3rd or 4th, wherever they turned up last time, to win is a nonsense, really. They know they're not. But Alison and that team have to say to people, there'll be a lot of anti-Tory vote. The place to put it is in the Lib Dems.
Yeah, but don't forget, Labour mismanaged that at the last general election. They were moving teams into place to defeat us, not to defeat the Tories, as Lisa Smart would tell you if she'd have been on this broadcast.
Yeah, I mean, we were
at the same time. 25 miles away, they were losing seats to the Tories. They have no understanding of how elections work. They just happen to win them more than we do.
And we got that from the local Labour Party in Tiverton, Honiton, and especially in North Shropshire, where they were saying, oh, no, ignore what everyone's saying. The Lib Dems aren't going to win. We're going to win it. And actually, we know there are certain types of seat that Labour can't win. And the fact is, the only people that are going to beat the Tories ever in that seat are the Lib Dems. And I expect that will be part of those 91 seats where we're second place. Huge chunks of them were against the Tories where Labour have no chance. Yeah. So there are big opportunities for the Lib Dems to do that. If we target correctly, we don't spread ourselves too thin, and we do the work. That's where we've got to be.
Yeah, indeed.
So, but we've also, one of the other big issues I want to get on to that's happened this year, obviously we're going to talk about foreign issues. The war in Ukraine has changed everything in terms of politics in the UK, not just economically, how we view ourselves in the world. I mean, and it really brought her, I mean, a large-scale land-based war in Europe was a thing I never thought I would see. And I admit to, and like many experts, we didn't think Putin would try that. And I suppose right now I should also thank some of our incredible guests we've had throughout the year, not least the Ukrainian MP who came on. And when Kira Ruddick came onto the show, the convoy of Russian armour was heading towards Kyiv. Everyone thought Kyiv would fall within days, and she had just been put on the kill list, the Putin's kill list. And I remember after the show, I was quite emotional afterwards. Obviously, once we'd stopped recording, thinking that she was likely to die in some point in the next few days trying to defend her country. And the bravery of the Ukrainian people and what's happened since was just incredible, Richard.
Absolutely. People say, why are we sending them money? We're sending them money to defend our border. Yeah. And it's not just in the UK that there's been political change. It's quite clear that the way NATO is regarded in America, yes, there are some Republican MAGAs, as it were, or perhaps they're maggots, who don't think any money should go, but there's a general acceptance in America. We've had 2 applications to join NATO. And perhaps I can remember the Cold War, not in any detail, but I marched in one of the last Aldermaston marches for CND. I can remember the Cold War. I can remember the Berlin Wall falling. But many people now either have forgotten or didn't know any of that. Yeah. And they just assumed it was all fine, and it hasn't been. The Russian people are as nice as any. I've worked in Russia briefly, but the Russian leadership are a bunch of snakes. And isn't it
The
interesting?
gangsters. The gangsters.
The gangsters. And
Yeah.
you can see that the number of people who happen to have died recently who've annoyed Putin,
One just 2 days ago.
Traveling all over the world to commit suicide out of hotel windows.
Putin has clearly lost touch with reality in terms of. I went to Russia in 2005, and which was strange enough, probably the safest time in probably the last century to have actually gone and visited Russia.
Yeah.
But I think COVID, he has clearly become almost sociopathic or psychopathic, or depending. He's clearly lost touch with some portion of reality, and it almost makes me more worried that it's gone really badly for him and what he might do. Because actually, and it's a similar thing you could say about China as well. Xi Jinping and the Chinese authorities haven't had this level of protest since Tiananmen. And how they respond going forward is very interesting. But
for that matter, Russia, where there are more demonstrations.
Yeah.
And I think we underestimate how we say it's difficult being a Lib Dem here. It isn't, compared to being someone in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Russia, in China, and so many of these places where you literally risk your life. And execution.
Yeah.
Just by saying the wrong thing or giving someone who's injured help who'd been on a demonstration.
But I generally leave 2022 though slightly more optimistic about the worldview than I left 2021. Yes. I will say almost. I heard someone put this quote. I can't remember exactly where I heard it. Is 2022 has been a victory for boring centrist dads. And, the idea that all the things we thought was a little bit odd, whether it's cryptocurrencies or, bonkers American politics or Bolsonaro in Brazil, all these things where there has been a shift a little bit away from the extremes. Now,
incredible results in America, in Brazil, a poor result in France.
Yeah, and that was interesting. That was the nenext point I was going to make. Probably that the French election was maybe the different. I mean, and we should forget in Hungary, he was re-elected. I've forgotten his name now. What's his name? In Oban in Hungary was re-elected. But generally. I do think in France, actually, just to finish that point, is that the Ukraine war probably helped Macron in his election in terms of now's not the time to have some a radical change.
He's also seen as a leader.
Yes, that's right.
Because of that.
But genuinely, I think, we'll talk a little bit about the US now, because that was very interesting. I do think the Roe versus Wade decision on abortion really energized moderates. And I think now Trump is toxic for the Tory party. So that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? For the Republican Party. You saw in the midterms. You have to remember, midterms, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, all this had horrendous midterm losses where they lost control. The Democrats lost the House very narrowly, but
they only gained 9 seats,
something like that. Yeah, so they've and actually increased their representation by 1 in the Senate is actually remarkable, and I think the Republicans overplayed their hand in terms of Roe versus Wade, and the Americans and the Democrats didn't make it about Biden, which was interesting. They made it about the issue. They made it about, vote on, I can't remember when the actual contest were. It was actually in November, wasn't it? The midterm,
I think.
Whenever it was, November 11th or whenever it was, where they said, actually, this is your chance to protect women's rights. This is your chance to protect the Supreme Court or whatever you needed to do. So, like I said, I generally leave, this year feeling more optimistic that the world is maybe coming back from where it was.
Yeah, I think you're right. And all that tells me that we've got to protect the institutions, the global institutions we're in, be that the UN or NATO, because you need your friends when times are hard. It also tells me quite clearly that we've got to, at the minimum, rejoin the single market. As a first step. There are other things we can do, like going back into Erasmus wholeheartedly. And I think Europeans would let us in with a lot of half measures that they would accept if we're clearly wanting to go back. that they wouldn't tolerate as we were clearly trying to get out. So I think we've got to remember where our friends are and work with them, because China and Russia are not our friends. America wasn't under Trump. There's no special relationship, in my view, with America, but I could work with Biden. I can work with Democrats in a way that I couldn't work with Trump. But so you're right. Some of the worst poison seems to have been drawn.
Except in Twitter, where we seem to have an idiot now who's running it. But we'll deal with Elon Musk. But again, Elon Musk is suffering the consequences of that. If you look at the Tesla share prices since he took over Twitter, and starts with his conspiracy theories, they've absolutely fallen through the floor, because unbelievably, and because most Teslas are owned by, kind of fairly wealthy liberal people, and unbelievably by touting all sorts of right-wing nonsense has actually hurt him particularly. But it's interesting what will happen with Twitter as he continues.
I mean, Twitter, I don't know about you, but I've seen far more Americans on my timeline, and even worse, most of them are very nice, but a considerable number of right-wing nut jobs, frankly. So I am preparing a bolt hole on mastodon.social, and I've got 1,800 followers there. Mostly from people who are leaving Twitter.
I wonder if it'll be, because I looked at Mastodon, it isn't as intuitive as Twitter. Me, I haven't really gone into it in any sort of grave depth, but I do wonder if one of the other big companies, whether that's Meta, Google, Apple, will think, hang on, if Twitter's going to explode, having a micro-blogging site with all their resources might be something they do. Maybe that's one of my 2023 a rival competitor.
Site, don't forget, John. That's the difference. It's about 100 sites that interlink.
Yeah.
So it'd be very difficult to take over. And I must say, the people I talk to, communicate with on Mastodon seem a very small liberal group of people from around the world. We can chat and exchange information the way that you and I would. That's getting increasingly difficult on Twitter.
Yeah. So we've got several issues still to cover, and they're all kind of interlinked, which is one. One is going to be the environment, which links into the economy and cost of living. And then that also, we can't do about the economy and cost of living without talking about our wonderful lettuce of a Prime Minister, Liz Truss, the greatest Lib Dem sleeper agent in history. Now, obviously, Liz Truss came in. I mean, most people listening to this podcast will be fully aware she lasted 44 days, less than the shelf life of a lettuce, which was that very comical story that came
in
out.
a paper we don't mention.
No, we don't mention. Where was the it was the Star. To the fact that what does this mean for far-right libertarian politics? Because they've always said David Cameron wasn't one of us. If we had a proper Boris Johnson wasn't one of us. He wants to spend money. They finally get everything they want, and it screws up the economy. And what is it? Things come out today that £75 billion has been wiped off the British economy. They got the Prime Minister they wanted, the Chancellor they wanted, the budget they wanted. And you remember the papers, the Daily Express, the Mail, the Telegraph, all saying, at last, a proper Tory budget, and it collapses within, days. So what does that mean does that mean that will ever be happen again? What will happen to that wing of ideology, Richard?
A cult is a cult. And they don't believe that anything went wrong, that other people made it go wrong. You've only got to look at the work, the things coming out of Jacob Rees-Mogg. I didn't actually see him on Question Time, but I did see the recording of it. There was this chap who was an exporter saying how bloody difficult it was, how he'd lost business all over the place. And Jacob Rees-Mogg basically told him it's not true. Well, I know who I believe and who almost everyone else believed. There are still people who believe that this so-called sovereignty that we've gained was all worth the problem. But of course, there was no problem. It was all down to other people like Putin and other circumstances. Every figure that I've seen from every respected independent organisation said that Brexit has caused us 5% of the inflation increase that we've got is causing us 5% decrease in our GDP, which hinders our ability to pay for the NHS and other services. But they don't think any of that. So 55 Tufton Street is still spewing out as much filth as United Utilities is onto our beaches.
And Truss herself has said she didn't think she did anything wrong.
Yeah,
that might be the fact that Liz Truss is, borderline nuts. But there's the fact that
borderline. I'd like to challenge that assertion.
Yeah, you think she definitely is. Yeah. But it's just one of those things where I'm not sure what they can do, but I think it's also part of the fact is the Tory party has been hollowed out of decent thinkers. I think that goes back to what Boris did, that kind of purge of, people like Nicholas Soames, for example, Ken Clarke, people like that, people who, they're not liberals, they wouldn't be in our party, but at least they had a brain between their ears and instead replaced them with yes men and loyalists. And I've just been back home. I've been back home to see my dad, who lives just on the Copeland Allerdale border in West Cumbria. And there's not a single Labour MP now in Cumbria. They're all Tory except Tim Farron. And the MP for Workington is a former UKIPper who, let's face it, is just thick. He is just a dumb yes man who loved Boris Johnson. And actually, if you surround yourself with them, it's not a problem. It's not a surprise, that your cabinet is full of sycophantic kind of nobodies that lack the intellectual rigor to run a country.
Bolsonaro, Trump. What's the difference?
Yeah,
you create an echo chamber. That's of course one of the problems with Twitter and social media sometimes, and that's why it's very important. Just to get back to idea of proper campaigning, to be out on the doorstep, out talking to people and listening to ordinary people. But I think that the Tory party is now in severe difficulty. You're right, there were decent Tories. You and I didn't agree with them, but you could agree to disagree in an honourable way. And you could probably find 60 or 70% most of the time that you could agree with.
Yeah.
But Ghoulish and places like Ghoulish, is it? Or Goulash? Or
yeah.
Ghoulish is probably most of it. I look at him and think he was a teacher, for goodness sake. How did he get through the vetting process for that? It's understandable how he got through the vetting process to become a Tory MP, not to become a teacher. So if you were a decent, nice Tory, when would you step back into the cauldron of the Tory party today?
And I think about this because we have in one of our wards here in Preston, we have a split ward. So there's 2 Lib Dem councillors, 1 Tory. So we're up next year, and then the following year we're hoping to get rid of the last of the Tories. But so they're putting forward this young lady who wants to basically take a seat of us, and I really struggle to think what's her motivation to being a Tory. And she actually goes on social media and says, I'm not really a Tory, I want to do stuff for my community and stuff like that. Then why choose it? I can't get why she would choose the Tory party as that particular foil, other than a personal relationship she might have with, or friendship she has with the other councillor. I don't know.
That sounds an interesting theory we ought to pursue.
No. When I said that, I don't mean as in her kind of sexual. I mean as in she's made friends. Right. That's all. Well, I'm not going to put that out. But
because Tories have a different motivation than we do. I spoke before about would you like to be the first or second person on the council? Because Liberal Democrats think that way. We think of our ward, what I could do as a ward representative.
That then leads us to what's happened in the last kind of month or so is actually we're having a series of Tory MPs saying they're not going to stand at the next election. Now,
the brightest and the best by the look of them.
Yeah, but what's interesting that, so you talk about what motivates Tories. So if they were just after, say, the money of it, even if you know you're going to lose, whether it's like one of the really marginal red wall seats, for example, if you stand and get defeated, you get a big payout. But a lot of these people are going now because they just think this ship has sailed for us.
Yeah, and there's somewhere, Oxfordshire, somewhere, 23-year-old or 25-year-old who was clearly seen as a future leader, only got in 2000.
Are you talking about Davina Davidson?
Yes, yeah.
She's Durham. She's in
Durham.
Durham, sort of.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
I knew it was a rural area.
Yeah.
Uh, just 200 miles.
Wrong.
But both Lib Dem controlled, if I could get that
Yeah.
in, by very strong Lib Dem women. And she doesn't want to be stained. She doesn't want that to be on her CV. I did. I got in. I got out again. And perhaps in 20 years, you might see her again.
Come back.
But I think that everyone's finding their lifeboats at the moment, except those for whom there will be no lifeboats. I mean, who'd employ Jonathan Goulis?
Yeah. I mean, who. So do we think this is going forward now? So what Rishi Sunak's got a heck of an in tray for next year. And we could talk about, so, we talk about the economics of the cost of living, inflation, etc. That starts to bite next year. What do they do with the energy cap in, say, April time? How do they get this right? I mean, not to mention the NHS crisis in terms of not just the strikes that are happening right now, but generally we're not solving that backlog. How do they deal with that? Given that he doesn't really command massive authority within his own party, particularly in his membership, but even within the MPs, there's a lot of rebels fighting their own little causes.
You can see that on the Greenbelt issue, the planning.
Yeah. So what does the future? What's next year's main problems you see for Rishi Sunak?
Yeah. Well, perhaps I should invite my grandson back into the room because he's very keen on Harry Potter. Because I think it's going to involve a magic wand and Harry Potter type scenarios for Rishi Sunak to get back into favour. I say that because I think they've just now gone so far that people have given up on them. As we said before, they haven't necessarily gone to Labour, but they've given up on the Tories. What we need is a strong and confidence enunciation of a series of policy areas. The first is this country needs an industrial strategy. That then is the basis of a strong economic strategy, which says we will spend more on this, but particularly we'll invest more on things that will increase the revenue. We cannot do a lot of that. And I keep coming back to this issue. You may think I'm obsessed with it, but unless we're in the single market, we can do without the EU if there are sovereignty problems in that. But going back into the single market will recreate the markets, which will recreate the wealth, which will enable us to pay for the things that we want. And I think there is an element in which we could tax the rich more. Now, I don't know what rich is. Anyone earning more than about 100,000 seems rich to me. But it is. But I'm not proposing that as a policy. But there are lots of people, as we've seen with Baroness Mone, who can disappear with 20 million by putting it into trust for herself and her two children. Yeah. They've managed to buy things. So I think that there are lots of very rich people around who could and should be taxed more. Yeah. And I think there
unearned wealth as well. So not just on income, on unearned wealth, which is
absolutely,
which was the thing. Yeah,
there are lots of fiscal escape holes for companies to take their money out of the country as well. So I don't think this country is short of money. I think it's short of usable money because of our economy works like a colander.
Yeah, and I think the issue regarding single market, I'm in complete agreement. I think Lib Dem should go into the next election saying we want to rejoin the single market and the customs union because we have to be brave. I mean, let's face it. Let's be completely honest with people. The only reason Labour aren't saying that is there's two reasons. A, they were stupid enough to vote for Boris's deal, so it kind of tied them in, which was still unbelievably short-sighted for them to do. But the second one is they don't want to talk about immigration. And they're not brave enough to say, actually, immigration is a good thing and it's necessary in this country.
Yeah, but we're short of people to pick our crops. We're short of people to look after our elderly. We're short of doctors. We're short of nurses. We're short of people in the city of London, apparently. So whether you're going to earn the minimum wage, which is about 17,500 or 170,000, we haven't got the skills.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we've got immigrants who we don't allow to work, who have some of those skills or could rapidly be trained to do some of the lower grade jobs while they establish themselves, and as immigrant communities do, build up generations.
And neither Labour or the Tories will be able to square that circle without without having to say to people, I mean, the Tories what they might do is actually, we saw the immigration figures last at that they had gone up to, I think, 400 something thousand, something like that.
Yeah.
Is the fact that they will
just largely Hong Kong, don't forget.
It is, yeah. I mean, that is because you have Ukraine, Hong Kong, and other refugees, and Afghanistan refugees coming over.
Yeah.
However, I wonder if they will just say, yeah, talk tough, but actually allow a lot of immigration happening. But that is a cost implement where the single market and free movement of people allowed complete ease of goods, and and we're talking also about the trade barriers and everything. We're dealing with an economic, a trade, and a workforce crisis, all of which would be solved or partly solved by joining the single market and the customs union again.
Instead, the idea is to get old people working longer.
Yeah. That's it. So people like my father-in-law who's retired and my mother-in-law who's a retired nurse have all been asked, would they be interested in doing shifts?
Yeah,
but we lost 1 million people out of our workforce during COVID through early retirement, long-term sick, moving away,
life readjustment.
Yeah, that's right.
Decided they didn't want to be on the Ferris wheel or whatever it is. Yes.
Obviously, we've had some, as with all years, we have sad moments, but obviously very markedly this year was the death of Queen Elizabeth II, which, whether you're Republican or a monarchist or don't care one way or the other, it was definitely a sea change in Britain, and someone who had given service for that length of time, and obviously very disturbing things across the country and across the world in terms of climate change. We had the Pakistani floods. We had the UK hitting 40 degrees for the first time ever. So climate change and how we deal with that, particularly when we talk cost of energy. One thing that I've been absolutely spitting feathers about is how poorly we have been since the Ukrainian war happened about doing simple things to help energy efficiency in our homes. Central Europe got on with it. You can insulate homes fairly cheaply and easily quickly. And we were so late in the day that, and our housing stock is already one of the worst in Europe for being energy efficient.
One of the oldest as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we are, but countries that, I know people say, oh well, some of these new developed countries have a chance to do it. We're not talking about countries that have just come from nowhere, like Germany and Austria and places in Western Europe that have suddenly decided, actually, one of the best ways we can save money on an energy crisis is making people spend less right at source.
Yeah, that's right. And the fact is that if you give someone who's poor money, they tend to spend it in their local community, which creates another job. If you give someone rich money, they either take it out of the country or just lock it away in a bank account.
Yeah, that's right.
Unless they're totally greedy and do something stupid like Elon Musk did.
Which is why when we did the raising of the income tax threshold, which was a Lib Dem policy adopted and now no one dares touch because it was such a good idea, that was exactly that thing, that if you give people more of their money that at the lower end of the economic scale, they will spend it.
Yeah, and the same with pensions. That was why the triple lock was good, although because that's a universal benefit, it does distort. But I mean, don't forget that the triple lock has put more people at the top end into a tax paying bracket, so we get some of that back. But I go out here in Liverpool. 60% of our city in what are called super output areas. That means that they're poor. There are people not eating. And the thing that I can't understand the Tories not understanding is that most of these people are workers.
Yeah.
So they have this simple idea. On the one hand, you've got workers, and on the other hand, you've got shirkers. In fact, I listened to someone, it was on Radio 4, someone from Old Swan, which is 3 miles from here, to say, my husband and I've got 3 jobs, my husband has got 1. Because we've got 3 kids, we bring in 18,500 a year. That I struggle to find packed lunches for my kids. The people down the road who haven't got a job, and I'm not condemning them, get a free lunch. So if you're working 3 jobs between you and you can't afford lunch for your kids, then what's the point of working?
Yeah, the system's not working, is it? That's the point. Yeah. I'm self-employed, so I have probably the greatest amount of flexibility to technically go out and get more work if required. But during that energy crisis, when it looked like my bills were going to go from £1,000 a year to £5,000 a year, it was, and you saw people like Martin Lewis make this thing. Most people only have savings of about £500. That's what they have. And so where would people find that extra £4,000? And this is, I think, for me, and we'll talk about Lib Dem prospects, is that I think that squeezed middle class vote is absolutely key, because people don't have a spare £4,000, and there were people right up to, say, the higher tax bracket, up to £45,000, £50,000. Suddenly we're thinking, actually, I'm going to be close to fuel poverty here. I don't have that much spare cash to be able to do it. And so it's an opportunity for the Lib Dems, because these are people that would probably naturally vote Tory, who might be willing to vote for us, but just because the thing is about competence. And the Tories' lack of competence is pushing people away.
Yeah, well, £74 billion, £75 billion, it was confirmed today. That's just wasted. And a lot of people, particularly younger people, possibly yourself, you're a bit younger than me.
Hitting 40 next year.
Costs. I've paid my mortgage, so that one doesn't affect me. But mortgage rates have gone up and will stay up. Electricity prices have gone up. They say, the inflation will come down. Yes, but it will, but it'll be on a much higher figure. So that 74 billion is just what it costs the government, not what it costs you and I and the other 60-odd million people who. And
I was having this chat with my father-in-law. He was very lucky. His fixed-term energy costs have just come to an end now. So he's going to get that jump of energy prices that we've all had to deal with for 6 to 8 months, depending on when your deal's finished. But again, my mortgage, I got a 5-year fix that comes to an end in June. And I'm quite lucky. I may only have like 100,000 left on my mortgage. There'll be people with a lot bigger mortgages than I have. So my bills will go up maybe 200 odd pounds a month.
Or it may not, because that might come down.
It might. Let's hope. But the fact is that is again a cost that it will really hit people in pocket. And Hannah Kitchen said last year, the Tories will come undone, whether it was on Brexit or anything else, when people start feeling it in their wallets. People are feeling it in their wallets, and I think
the economy's stupid. I think someone clever.
That's absolutely right. So, Richard, to round off this episode, let's just talk about what we think are going to be the big things of next year. So, I'll start with one big, really kind of nerdy political one. Obviously, the big change is going to be our parliamentary boundaries. They will change in May, which will reshape a lot of our politics. Will reshape. So I've just been selected for a seat that will no longer exist. I made a bit of a joke on this.
Wise move by the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, that's right. So, I said my next seat might be at Atlantis South or Pompeii North. Let's go for places that won't exist again. But that will be a huge change. It will be a huge opportunity and risk for the Lib Dems. Having new sets of people that aren't used to Lib Dems, maybe going into areas where Lib Dems are very active. So that's a big one. I think there'll be other by-elections. I think Labour's lead will shorten as we get near as well. And I think there'll be elements of panic within Labour about that. That will be my thing, because I think that when you get a 30-point lead and it whittles down to maybe 12, even though 12 points is healthy, you think, well, we were at 30. And I think the economic realities are going to be really, really tough this year coming, and I think the Tories are going to struggle to find the answers to it.
Yeah, well, the Delphic option has spoken now, Oracle rather, not option. And I agree with all that. Some people are partly protected from the cost of living crisis, but even so, you go out shopping, and even I notice the difference. I mean, caviar's gone up by about 50%.
Oh, Richard!
Spoiled it. Actually, I don't like caviar. I was given it on a trip to Russia once. Oh God, this is dreadful.
No, it's not.
But everyone knows that they're feeling the pinch. And if you don't, you're thinking, are my kids okay? Are my grandchildren coping? So unless you're really wealthy, then you are affected. And most of those people who are really wealthy think they're affected. So I think the cost of living will be there. And that's why I think the Liberal Democrats ought to concentrate on it as a policy area. And of course, coming back to what I keep saying, and you keep saying, that brings us back to Europe irrevocably.
Yeah.
I think we have to be far more proactive, as you rightly said, on green issues. The first thing I do every day is to look at my smart meter. And think, oh, thank God I got the 9 solar panels put in, because even today I'm probably selling a little bit of electricity back into the grid. But those are jobs, some of which can be relatively cheap and relatively cost effective, but the benefits last 30 years. We haven't talked about climate change, and I have a certain element of pessimism here. People are reacting to increased energy costs only as a cost issue, not as a fundamental issue as to why are we in this place. So there is some movement, but it's all being looked at as a cash thing rather than how do we generate electricity and power thing.
It's all about, can we get more gas from Qatar or somewhere else as opposed to Russia, as opposed to the demand side of it is how can we actually become more self-sufficient in our own homes,
in our own country. Where's the
and it's not fracking. I want to say fracking is not the answer, in case anyone thinks
just in case you thought Preston Liberal Democrats would change their policy. Certainly not.
But I suppose the other big issue that has to be resolved at some point, and it's linked to Europe, is Northern Ireland. How then will they deal with that, of where Northern Ireland fits into the EU protocol?
Well, there are a number of constitutional issues. Northern Ireland is possibly, and I could say this literally, perhaps the most explosive of these, because there are serious tensions building up, although not as bad as I feared a few months ago. And thank goodness there's the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland in there, our sister party, and we've had them on this year, Stephen Farry, their MP, and Naomi Long, their leader in Stormont, talking really good sense. And there does appear to be, in a way, as we discussed before with Bolsonaro and Trump, a moving away from religion and politics. Younger people aren't as bothered about these issues. They can be Catholic, Protestant, whatever, Hindu, Jewish, and they're very happy with other people being something else. So I think there are changes there. The other big constitutional issue that we'll have to deal with for the local elections is this very sad position about having to prove who you are to be able
voter ID. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I'm absolutely appalled. There was a fatal amendment moved by our own Baroness Pinnock. If Labour had supported it, that could have been dropped, certainly in time for this year's election. They'd have to resurrect it, I understand it, with another bill. And the Labour peers didn't vote. And yet we've had a motion in Liverpool from the Labour Party condemning the Tories. Well, we're getting another one at the next council meeting condemning the Labour Party for that. But, here's the problem. I've been in elections now. The first election I helped in was 1967. I think in the whole of the time since, there have probably been 20, 25 people prosecuted for election offences. It's tiny.
Well, I think it was the Newsagents podcast that made the point. In the last 10 years, there's been 240 million ballots cast, and the convictions for voter impersonation is just 4. Because there's easier ways of, if you really want to mess around with the system, there are easier ways of doing it than voter impersonation.
Perhaps we ought to do a blog on that, which only goes to Liberal Democrats.
Maybe. But no, thank you very much.
Guide to cheating.
And I'm sure some Labour people in Preston already think I have that. Thank you so much, Richard, for this review of the year. Thank you all the listeners for watching and viewing. We'll have loads more episodes coming up as we ramp up into the new year, in towards local election season. We'll have more interviews with people who have been selected to be our target candidates across the country, including young Tom Morrison hasn't done his yet for Cheadle, so we will make sure he comes back on the podcast. But thank you very much, Wilson. Have a wonderful new year if you're watching this in the next couple of days. Do look after yourself. Keep out of this horrible wind and rain that's happening at the moment, and we'll be back with another episode very soon.